Characterization, the act of making your character more than just a set of numbers on a sheet of paper, is one of those situations where less is more. That is, thinking or working too hard at it is more than likely going to end not exactly how you want it to. In the past, I've heard of and even had a few players who had written backstories to their characters that were several pages long. Most bafflingly, these were for characters at the game's starting point. That's a lot of effort to put into a character, especially when you consider that in a lot of games, the starting point for characters can be pretty lethal. Even if you're playing a game where character death isn't common, you should still take care not to over-characterize them. It's entirely possible that when you actually come around to playing your character, you might not actually play them out as you originally imagined, which would lead then to your character having a backstory that isn't consistent with how they're currently acting. Most important is this though. You can't guarantee anybody else at the table, not even the GM, will care about your backstory, especially if it's a long-winded one. Remember the players with several pages long backstories I mentioned earlier? I actually ignored those backstories entirely. A good GM can make events from characters' past become relevant to the present. That is true. However, that's a technique that I, as a GM, generally avoid. While it is possible to make one character's past affect the entire party, that's still likely to only get one player invested. Don't get me wrong, it's not bad to go into a character with an idea in mind for what they've done so far, or what they might behave like. But writing it down in a many pages long volume is committing too much to the idea. This is especially true if you aren't knowledgeable of the setting of the game, a very likely scenario to be in if your GM likes to make up their own settings. The phrase collaborative storytelling gets thrown around often when people talk about role-playing games, and it's kind of a misnomer for player and GM alike. While there is a story that can be told, you can't treat it like writing a book. There's other characters in the story you don't necessarily have control over, which is also to say nothing of the random element introduced by the dice. It's more accurate to think of it as improv theater, where what matters most is the present. And in order to be able to act in the present, you have to be willing to accept what's been established and not to be overcommitted to what you want to have happen. Let me give an example of what I mean. Let's say a player writes in their multi-page backstory that they're seeking revenge against an evil wizard that cursed their family, and that said wizard is secluded in the mountains since he hates forests and civilization. If the GM or other players decide to take the game in the opposite direction of the mountains where the wizard is hiding, the plot point has become somewhat irrelevant. By contrast, if the player instead mentions, in character, that they're seeking revenge against a wizard and leaves it at that avoids committing too much to the wizard's whereabouts. This means effort isn't really expended on deciding details about the wizard, and also the GM is free to have them appear wherever. Granted, it's theoretically possible that a player's elaborate backstory, the GM's plans, and how a character plays out can all mesh up perfectly. According to the laws of probability, though, the more coincidences you need to rely on, the less likely it is for a specific event to occur. It's better to leave things open until they're needed. That way, you can remain flexible.